Some content in this podcast is sensitive and may evoke emotional responses or may not be appropriate for younger audiences.
Now this is recording. RTI
International
Center for
Forensic
Science
presents
Just Science.
Welcome to Just Science, a podcast for forensic science professionals and anyone who is interested in learning more about how real crime laboratories work. In episode 4 of the identification season, Just Science interviews Robert Thompson, Senior Forensic Science Research Manager at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, about his role in the investigation of the Molalla Forest Murderer. In 1988, Dayton Leroy Rogers was convicted and imprisoned for the serial murder of 7 women over the course of 3 months. Robert Thompson was heavily involved in the investigation and conviction of this killer. Listen along as our guest discusses the intimate details of the case and the years that followed. This season is funded by the National Institute of Justice's Forensic Technology Center of Excellence. Here is your host, Dr. John Morgan.
And welcome to Just Science, the podcast for forensic science professionals. If you're a forensic science professional or an aspiring one, welcome on board. If you are just an interested bystander, you're welcome too. We're glad to have you. I'm John Morgan, your host with the Forensic Technology Center of Excellence. I'm here today not only with our esteemed producer, Lauren Mangum, but also with our esteemed guest, Robert Thompson from the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Robert is a Senior Forensic Science Research Manager with the Special Programs Office of Forensic Sciences at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and has over 38 years of experience as a forensic scientist and criminalist. Certified in criminalistics by ABC, past chairman and current member of AFTI's Certification Program Committee, fellow of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, distinguished member of AFTI, court-accepted expert in about 1 billion forensic disciplines, and all-around good guy. In his many years in forensic science, both from working at NIST on the research side, but also as a practitioner, Robert's been involved in a number of cases. We're going to talk about one that he did when he was with the Oregon State Police, which was the Molalla Forest serial murders, which was, I guess, just about the most notorious set of serial murders in Oregon history, right?
Yes, as for the number, certainly of the victims, yeah.
And Robert was very heavily involved from the very, very beginning in that case. And that case actually, in terms of sentencing and things like that, has had decades just about worth of professional work for Robert to have. It's been quite the case for you in that regard, hasn't it?
Yes, it's the typical definition of what ends in a sentence. It's basically an appeal. In this case, there was multiple appeals, of which I had to testify in every one of the resentencing.
So when did you start with the Oregon State Police?
Started in 1985.
1985.
Back when dinosaurs ruled the earth.
Well, yeah, I was a grad student, actually, at the time.
I was working in forensic MASH units.
Okay.
While you're doing your nice, easy master's and graduate degree.
Yeah. It was a fun time, the 1980s. So were you a criminalist then with
Yes.
OSP?
I was a journey-level criminalist, and I was primarily specific to trace and serology and enzyme and genetics. Enzyme genetics back then, prior to DNA. Later on, I helped set up the DNA laboratory there, but we did a trace, serology. All of us went out to crime scenes, everything from homicides to meth labs, for the major cases at least. It was back in the RFLP days.
Okay, sure. You needed a lot of material for that.
Yeah,
That was hard.
a bit much more material and a lot more time to get any results. Usually your first results came off after extraction and everything, about 2 weeks to maybe a full panel of 4 loci in a month.
Nice. So the Molalla Forest murders, what was the name of the individual who was eventually convicted?
The convicted person was named Dayton Leroy Rogers. I think it's always interesting that serial murderers always have 3 names. You know, they always have the middle name in there for some reason. But
Did he have a criminal history before the serial murders?
yes, actually he had one that was of enough concern that people who were his probation officers were warning about him getting too early a release when he was much younger. But he was legitimate as best people could see for his job. He had a business. He had a wife and kids.
What was his business?
It was in sharpening chainsaws and lawnmower repairs, which became a problem a little later for us to do some of our comparisons. He basically didn't have any criminal history when he was older until we found out what he was truly doing in the evenings, and that was killing prostitutes.
Was this something that he had started to frequent prostitutes just generally, or did he only do it when he was murdering, involving
Not sure
homicides?
about his proclivities before. He did have some of the prostitutes that were potential victims survived his attacks over the months that he was kind of clustering these crimes. But we assume that that was true. Of course, as we've seen over the years, unfortunately, that population of victims is easy to be preyed upon because of they're on the street. They're obviously in a risky profession, and unfortunately, they become prey to these type of people.
Do we know when his series of murders started?
Yes, I was the examiner on his last homicide, where he had a certain MO, found out later, picked up a prostitute. He had a little pickup truck and had her in a parking lot near a restaurant, and he liked to tie them up, use a knife, and she was stabbed multiple times, and something spooked him. I think someone saw him in a parking lot, saw some activity. He rolled her out of the vehicle and ran in to get rid of the knife, dumped all her clothes out in the parking lot, and took off. Well, some very smart witness and citizens took down the license number, and there was somewhat of a chase to get him. And ultimately, we had the crime scene where the body was dropped. Actually, she survived, went to the hospital, but didn't survive, even in multiple attempts at giving her units of blood. She just bled out.
This will be important later.
Yes,
so
it is.
She was stabbed multiple times. She was losing lots of blood.
Yes.
She got a large number of blood transfusions
Yes,
at the hospital at that time.
Yes.
Were they matching blood type? At that
I'm not sure whether they even bothered. I think it was one of these emergency things where they were just
hoping she hadn't gotten another transfusion.
Probably cross-typed her as best they could and then did it.
Yeah.
I remember getting post-transfusion samples that I had all kinds of ABO, so I'm assuming possibly. And this is a recollection, I'm not sure.
That's fine.
But what I did have to do is use tissue to get the correct ABO from the victim. We also found the knife, the crime scene where she was stabbed. In this parking lot, there was a blood trail to where the knife was found. Also happened to match set at his home. The blood had a mixture of not only the victims, but also the suspects at that time.
And how did you know that?
Actually sampling multiple, the handle and the blade. What happens in these type of frantic stabbings, there's no hilt or no guard on the knife. The blood gets onto the handle. It gets very, very slippery, and the suspect many times cuts themselves, and he was bleeding. And that's important because I was able to show a mixture of her blood and his blood later on in the case. Also, the samples going to where the knife was finally found was his blood type.
So you say the same MO. So how much was similar across all the different murders? Was this?
Once what had happened was he was wrapped up on this homicide. We had no idea he was doing others.
Okay.
It was only about a month or two later when an archer up in the Molalla Forest, just outside of Portland, up in the Molalla Forest was deer hunting, and he missed a deer and he went after his shaft because they're expensive, and came across some decomposing bodies. Of course, he calls the police. When they found one or two, then they started looking for more, and there was actually multiple bodies of different stages. And because of the way they were comported and clothing missing, and also some other items that were at the scene, namely small orange juice containers and also miniature vodka bottles, they could tell that it was a signature here. When we evaluated the suspect's car, his truck, after the last homicide where we did not know there was a serial murder going on, we found some similar items in the vehicle. Also, what he did with the victim's clothing was actually take the clothing back to his shop in a stove, a wood stove, and burn all the clothing down. So when the investigators and myself went there a few times, finally sifted that stove, I found metal objects from more than just a single clothing, overnight bag.
Right.
There is multiple shoe eyelets, different bra connectors,
Sure.
different shanks from shoes. And it turned out that I was able to show that the shank from a burned shoe in that stove was similar in all ways to the shank of a shoe that was left at that last homicide in the parking lot.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I could show that something similar was burned in his stove.
So
That's just
yeah.
one of lots of evidence that started linking him not only to the last one, but as I was going through the evidence for the last homicide he committed, I thought, oh my God, this is probably related to the bodies being discovered up in the Molalla Forest.
Now, did they?
So independently, I was able to, then
Sure.
they, of course, by then, the detectives put 2 and 2 together also. So independently, I came to the same conclusion.
Was the orange juice and vodka stuff in the
There
pickup
was
truck? Or?
there was a strap of plastic in the back of the truck, of which I later tried to see if I could match that tear-off strip to caps that were still at the crime scene. I wasn't able to, but I was able to show there's certainly similar class characteristics.
Okay.
I was at the autopsy collecting the evidence. Took almost 2 days to do the autopsies because we're dealing with 6 victims.
So that included 6 victims from the forest, or 5 from the forest and 1 from the parking lot?
6 in the forest and 1
Okay.
in the parking lot, from what I recollect. I could be off one.
That's fine,
There's got to
yeah.
be so many people.
Yeah.
And you had to, so many of those, I think, at that time were Jane Does that slowly became identified over the years. The last one, just by the side, is I was collecting trace evidence out of the hair masses of the victims, but I carefully packaged all those hair masses, and years later, I think about a year or 2 ago, they found the hair masses from that Jane Doe, and they did some reanalysis of the DNA using new technology,
Yeah.
and were able to find the family, and then therefore identify the last victim out of all those people.
Wow.
It was nice to know that my care 2 decades ago helped identify someone.
Well, there's a lot
later.
of really cool stories, and they all go back to the idea of really, really good crime scene work and really, really
Yes.
good evidence collection, and that really is timeless, right?
Right, yeah. And also you have to have so much patience. I mean, people might want to get into our field thinking everything gets wrapped up in an hour with commercials. It literally took me, and I hate to use the word literally, but it literally took me 2 years to do all the microscopic work, all the comparisons. And one of the reasons was not that I was just sitting on my hands all the time. I had also 2 other serial murders going on. We had other casework going on. So you're kind of like a shorter cook. You're doing what you can, and then you get more samples in. You do what you can. So if you're going to get into this field, you can't just do one case at a time. You have to be able to manage your casework.
Do we know the time sequence or anything of that
He
nature?
did only, my recollection is he did almost all of his homicides within like 3 months, 2 to 3 months. So there was a cluster. So you can see he's probably ramping up, started enjoying killing people. But there were some ladies that were very lucky. They basically acquiesced and didn't fight it back. And in this case, that's what he wanted. So when they weren't any fun anymore, he kicked them out. That's probably why they survived. And they were able to testify in his earlier trials.
The case in the parking lot itself was your first line to Dayton Leroy Rogers, right?
His car, his house.
Car. So the car license plate led them directly to his house, I
It's
assume.
a small pickup truck, yeah.
Okay, or the pickup truck.
Yeah.
So you were able to match a shoe between the victim
Classy.
there and the stove. How big a stove was it?
It was just one of those, kind of like those wood stoves you have in the house. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a really large or anything like that. It was just, he kept stuffing stuff in there until it burned down.
Were you able to match stuff from that stove to some of the victims in the forest?
I think primarily the fact that we had so many items from more than one, would be objectively one person's clothing,
Right.
that helped. I mean, I don't know if I was able to actually match certain objects. I was able to match some glass particles that were from a earring and a partial earring in a hair mass that was related back to a victim.
I see.
So there was some of that. Basically, it's difficult to find comparison type material in that type of situation where bodies have been left out and decomposing. Now, another singular thing that was part of his criminology is that he had a foot fetish. and he had cut off some of the victim's feet with a hacksaw. Now, when we were in the shop, we had lots of hacksaw blades, of which you had to do the comparisons, which gave me another quandary, is that how do I make proper tool marks in bone? What would be the right bone? What would be the right material? Now, I looked at the hacksaw blades that we recovered. I couldn't find any bone fragments under the microscope. So I'm back to doing the tool marks, at least to show similar class characteristics. The bones were cut through, and then it snapped. It's called a green stick snap. So there's a trough in that snapping part to be able to give an idea of the width of the blade. But hacksaws are hacksaws. I mean, it's not like you didn't really narrow down the population. But I wanted to make an attempt to the tool marks anyway. So what I arrived at is actually, rather than dealing with the ethical considerations of adding tool marks to the evidence that I had, which I had that cut off parts of the bone of the victims, we were able to show that actually ivory soap was some of the best tool marking type of material, because it's soft, it won't change the blade, and it has, under a microscope, very good microscopic features that mimic the tool mark.
And it's very uniform, because it's 99.44% pure.
But you can't just do the comparisons right on this material. You have to make casts. But
sure.
So we do. That's typical of tool mark examinations. So I did make an attempt to get a match, other than just saying class characteristics. But by then it was pretty apparent what kind of tool you used to cut off the bone ends.
Were you able to match him directly to any of the victims in the forest using trace or some other mechanism?
Actually, serology. He had cowboy boots that had a mixture of blood and was coming back to victims and not the last victim. One of the things we did was trace analysis for the hair. What his pattern was after he killed somebody, and he did a lot of the knifing inside the vehicle, was that in the vehicle I could find knife marks where he missed or went through the body. Also, he cleaned up as much as he could, and it's one of these interiors that had a vinyl interior and vinyl floor.
Sure.
He literally went to car washes with the wand car washes and basically washed out his interior after every homicide he did. So here I am trying to find trace blood, and I still was able to find blood in the channels underneath the mats.
Okay.
And on the window where it rolls down, it doesn't go all the way down. I was able to find some under there, under places that would be easy to clean, but on the opposite side, impossible to find. But we almost dismantled the interior of that vehicle to find blood. At the same time, we're collecting hairs that still might be bound up in the vehicle, and I was able to find hairs consistent with 3 of the victims to their standards, and exclude him and his family and the people who worked at a shop that had access to that.
This was a morphological
Yes, it would be a
examination?
side-by-side comparison under comparison microscopy. Clearly, that's not an identification, but I could show that I could discriminate amongst all those people.
The issue with hair microscopy, in my view, has always been the level of information. What are you going to say about it? I mean, what does it really add up to? But what's cool about what you're saying is that you have 3 different comparisons that add up to all the rest of the evidence.
Certainly.
They're if they are consistent with these victims, but not with anybody else who we know was in the car.
Yes.
That is powerful evidence.
I think so,
You don't
yes.
need to say it's that person's hair to the exclusion of all others in the world.
And I
That's
certainly
absurd.
was careful in my testimony to that too.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the evidence, even though it might not in itself be identification. If you keep at it and you do lots of different types of evidence, and they still keep leading back to a source or a scenario, then it's likely that is what happened. You just can't say it absolutely was this person. Like you said, it's more weight gets added to all the other
Fits the
circumstantial
story,
evidence,
doesn't it?
and
Yeah.
physical evidence, yes.
How did you find that there were other victims who wound up not getting murdered? Do they show up in some of the evidence that you were collecting?
Well,
or?
that was just good police work. That was just
Okay.
the guys hitting the ground and talking to that segment of the society in that area that he selected his victims from. So that's how they started putting all these pieces together. As we know in forensic science, it doesn't take the place of good police work. good interview skills, good just intuition. I mean, intuition, I think, is a lost component, or isn't discussed enough. We talk about bias and how bias can creep into comparisons or into investigations. And most often it's discussed in a negative way. And there are some concerns. You have to know about it. You have to realize that can be a part of your own examination. But part of that is, with that knowledge, is you design tests to test against the bias. You test against all the potential hypotheses that make sense. So knowing the bias and the research that's in it is very important. What I think gets lost is experience and intuition and anti-bias. So that's the term I would call it.
I prefer to use the word inference over intuition. But,
there you go. Inference, intuition. Just through experience, you know something's off.
Right.
You can't put your finger on it yet. So where the anti-bias comes from is if everything is so clear, like the detective tells you, I have a videotape of him shooting this clerk, and this is the gun. We arrested him an hour later. This is the gun. Match the bullets back to the firearm. If you are enamored and bias-prone, you could probably just test fire the firearm if it agrees and somewhat, and just write the comparison. But if you do it by a practical, objective way of doing the comparisons, by standard protocols, and also knowing that that's latent with all kinds of bias, and you do your comparison, it doesn't take long in your career, you'll find out that's the wrong gun, or that's the wrong blood type, or the blood type that we assumed at the hospital was typed incorrectly. And you find these things out because you don't assume ahead of time, and you do your analysis. So I say that those things that happen in your career, where someone is whispering in your ear, or even say a APHIS match score is really high, and you find out it's still an exclusion, or the detective was wrong even though he thought he had the right person, and you find exclusionary material, that inoculates you. You don't forget those instances that, okay, I caught it. I am so glad I did this comparison the way I did. So where I'm pointing to is those experiences where people were so sure but wrong, and they have that information in your case, but you still test it properly and you find that they're wrong, that is counter, I would say, to the negative bias. It's something that, because you are tuned to past cases where they were so wrong, or the results were incorrect, and you caught it, that also is part of that experiential knowledge that kind of combats that bias, I think.
Well, yeah, one of the things that happens, especially in a case like this, is that it's different from other people who work in like science, in the sense that you're encountering the world, right? And the world is full of variability that you can't necessarily anticipate at the beginning.
Exactly.
If you're doing like toxicology of a urine or blood sample or something like that, that's a little bit more predictable. Like when the blood typings started to come back from the final victim, you all must have been like, what the heck is going on here, right? I mean, so you were seeing multiple serology types coming out of that because of the blood transfusions, although you didn't know that at first, I assume.
Yeah, but we're kind of that time tuned to that, though. When we start seeing those blood types all over the place that didn't make genetic sense, then you know that's probably from the transfusions.
Was it all serology that you used initially in that case?
Yes, there was one attempt at an early DNA, but there wasn't enough at that time, enough DNA. Yeah. It was degraded. At that time, the typical blood stain that would be able to get a RFLP would be about the size of a quarter. I mean, a semen stain about the size of a dime. I mean, those are oceans of sample nowadays.
Yeah, that's a lot of copies of DNA for...
now we're dealing with touch DNA that's invisible to the human eye. What was interesting in this case, it taxed you in a way as an examiner that you had to be very patient. I had thousands of hairs to go through and a lot of population to compare to. So you can imagine how many intercomparisons that turns into. And you have to be somewhat prepared to take a lot of notes and organize yourself, because it is such a massive undertaking. On the main Molalla Forest murder case, I testified, I believe, almost 3 days, 2 for sure.
Wow.
Because I had so much evidence to talk about. That was a quick trial in comparison to some states.
Right, yeah. Did he tie up all of the victims?
The best we could assume. I can't remember. Some were in a tied up state, some weren't.
Yeah. Were you ever able to match things of that nature, like the rope or anything else that he used to secure
there
them?
were some not comparisons. That was actually done by the FBI to see if there was anything special about the knots that were on the victim's wrists.
But you've also been called in for sentencing work. So how did that relate to the forensic science?
What happened was, and I think it's a handful of times over the years, was that there would be a change in the Supreme Court ruling on death penalties, and either in the state or other states, and then became federal. I'm not sure if any of them went to the Supreme Court, but there was change in guidelines for sentencing, of which the earlier sentencing did not fulfill. So his defense team were able to successfully ask for another sentencing hearing. Now, the sentencing hearing is put together by a fresh group of jurors, and the question of guilt or innocence is not that point they have to decide, but they have to decide whether he deserves a death penalty or not, or whatever sentence they come up with. So the experts in the sentencing, both sides, are involved. However, the prosecutor in these cases knew that this is a fresh jury. It's many years now past. They just put on at least the evidence to show, obviously, that not only is he guilty, but here's what he was doing.
Right.
To add to it. And you can't really pull that off just by photos. You have to see the physical evidence. And if you have the physical evidence, you need an expert to testify about it.
I mean, just the fact that you were able to find his blood on the knife, the implication of that with respect to the violence of the act is clear to, I think, to a jury.
Well, also, no matter how much he tried to clear up his vehicle or his clothes, I was able to find other victims' blood on him. And then the hairs comparisons show that there was at least those people possibly were in the interior of the vehicle. What the prosecutor did was, and I don't want to belittle it, but it was a shortened version of the physical evidence that I testified to many days. Now I could do it maybe in about 3 or 4 hours, so it's a shortened version. We called it the Reader's Digest version of the physical evidence in case. And that was because the jury needs to see the physical evidence, not just maybe listen to earlier testimony. Those times I came back wherever I was working and testified in the sentencing hearing.
Okay. I don't know if I described it up front, but you are actually court accepted in, I think, 8 or 9 disciplines.
Yes.
And it sounds like you used the majority of them.
Yes, almost.
In this case.
It was serology, hairs and fibers, because I did a fiber component also. Tool marks, crime scenes, blood spatter, because there was some spatter that was inside the windshield and vehicle where he couldn't clean. They didn't see it before he got arrested from his last victim. Autopsy, collections, photography, technical photography, all those things. And that was not uncommon for a lot of us to have those type of cases that were interdisciplinary. Either we were doing it or we had a couple of cohorts in our lab doing the other specialties. What made this big was just the amount of physical evidence and the time it took to do all the examinations.
It seems like oftentimes, like the trace evidence folks feel like, oh, well, we're forgotten almost these days as a profession. I hope that that never happens, because we really do need, in cases like this and across the board, to be able to pull in sometimes unpredictable kinds of evidence.
I agree absolutely. While the source determinations in many cases are the thing that DNA is able to extract out and be able to point to people and exclude others. What's important with trace is it tells the circumstance. It's the context. It helps people understand where people were and weren't, what contact there was and wasn't. And there's a lot more historical reconstruction value in trace that shouldn't be lost. You can nail down a source, but that source might have a reasonable alibi that would argue why you found that DNA where you did. But he or she might have a harder time explaining why they have the carpet fibers of the trunk on the body. That's not DNA.
Right.
Why is there fragments of glass in a pocket of a guy doing a burglary when you can compare that back?
Sure.
I mean, there's things that are out there that are not DNA I know it's attractive because it's getting the ultimate evidence against a person on source if you have the comparison. But if you're going to be a full-service laboratory, I'm going to have to argue that you should have a very strong trace component, or at least have an ability to send it somewhere.
It's part of the
as a trace.
story. I mean, we were just talking here. We've done a podcast with looking at the research that shows, juries they trust the story. I mean, they have a story in their minds, and they're looking to see whether the evidence fits that.
Exactly.
And so that goes way beyond DNA. It really
Yes.
does.
And that is part of the work that a good defense attorney will do. Some of the best defense attorneys have a story.
Yeah.
And they have a story that fits the evidence, usually, and it depends on whether the jury believes the story or not. So if they have a story and the other side doesn't, then I think they're shortchanging themselves.
Well, an amazing set of forensic science investigations that literally and truly literally took you 2 years to do. Thank you, Robert, for being on Just Science.
Thank you very much.
Next week, Just Science interviews Aaron Sims about a case study involving a methamphetamine-fueled crime spree and double homicide. Opinions or points of views expressed in this podcast represent a consensus of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of its funding.